Many of the topics that I cover on this podcast come from a place of both personal experience and also my experience working with my students and clients. And when it comes to controversial and misunderstood topics in performance nutrition, carbohydrates are probably at the top of the list. If I look back to my endurance racing days and then my transition into strength training and high intensity training, I absolutely missed the mark at the beginning when it came to carbohydrate intake and really fueling in general. It wasn't until I started working with a sports nutritionist in 2012 and I saw it listed out in black and white that I realized really how low my carbohydrate intake was, by the way, along with protein and my overall energy intake as well. And when I finally started to implement some of the changes that he recommended, that's really when I saw my strength take off and my performance really start to improve. And a lot of the issues that I was dealing with really resolved. When I work with my students who come into Strength Nutrition Unlocked, my one-on-one clients, or I get questions and DMs from all of you out in the world, carbohydrates are absolutely at the top of the list when it comes to things that people are confused and also curious about. And one of the things that you can really move the needle on in your nutrition so that you get better outcomes from your training. In this episode today, we're going to be covering what do we know about carbohydrate intake for strength training, taking a look at some general recommended ranges, what are some considerations for the menstrual cycle, and a little bit more about practical takeaways. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you very much for being with me. If you're watching on YouTube, hello, welcome. Make sure you hit subscribe and ring the bell for more notifications. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, then absolutely hit subscribe there as well and never miss a new episode. Before we hop into all of the very juicy content that we're going to get to today, I just want to remind you about Strength Nutrition Unlocked. This is my group coaching program where we help you to implement and put into practice the Fuel Your Strength framework. We're really talking about performance nutrition, training, and recovery principles and practices for women over 40 with an eye to help optimize what's going on in our transition into perimenopause and beyond. So if you're curious about that, you're ready to stop DIYing and you want a coach who's going to be with you every step of the way to help you personalize, customize, get past your mindset sticking points, then I absolutely want to invite you to apply. And you can do that over at stephgaudreau.com/apply. We're going to provide you with the expertise, the coaching, and support that you need to be successful toward your goals in terms of strength, muscle, and performance. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. And this concept, this topic is so meaty and deep, and we cannot cover in this episode all that there is to know about carbohydrates and all of the different controversies and everything that exists. What we're really going to be looking at here is through the lens of strength athletes and folks who are doing shorter but intense training sessions. So generally speaking, what we're looking at here is strength athletes, power athletes, and people who are really engaging in maybe moderate to high intensity training in terms of cardio, but keeping it on the shorter duration side in general. And this is a general sports nutrition concept. The longer your sessions go, and the more intense your sessions get in terms of duration, the more carbohydrate intake you need. So this is something I absolutely fucked up when I was racing mountain bikes, endurance distance mountain bikes, and then triathlons. And I was also running prior to even doing any triathlons too. So I've done it. I've made the mistakes. I was very low carb and not eating enough. And I bring this to you from not only personal experience, but what I know about sports nutrition and all my training there. And so if you are somebody who's doing longer endurance sessions, we're really talking about anything over the 2-hour mark. So whether it's just regular endurance or ultra endurance, your needs are going to be different. Your carbohydrate needs will increase. You're going to have to start introducing intra-workout fueling as well. And that is beyond the scope of this exact episode. So if that applies to you, just know that your needs will change and be higher than even what we talk about here. So first and foremost, we need to understand that carbohydrates are a key fuel source in terms of the type of training that you're likely to be doing if you're listening to this episode. Like if you didn't click away because you're an endurance athlete who does no strength training and you don't do any shorter sessions, which is probably unlikely, you're probably doing some shorter stuff as well. But if you're still here and listening to this, you need to understand that the vast majority of what you're doing in terms of your training, right, your intense training occurs along the glycolytic pathway. So we do have that sort of creatine phosphate, ATP, quick, explosive, 1 rep max type of energy system. Then we have our glycolytic or sort of alactic anaerobic system, where we're really relying on muscle glycogen and then also blood glucose for those efforts. And then we have our longer duration aerobic system, right? So we have this continuum, and chances are, if you're listening to this still, you're probably falling in and along that glycolytic pathway. We need to understand though, that these fuel sources are used simultaneously. It's just which ones are the star of the show, if you will, right? So some people think, oh, once I, surpass a certain time, like that's when I start using free fatty acids or doing fat oxidation. And really it's happening all the time. It's just that is so slow compared to something like the glycolytic pathway and everything that's going on there, that we really can't use that fuel very efficiently to fuel our very short efforts, because it's cellularly just happens too slow to be able to support your activity level and intensity. The breakdown of glycogen into glucose for energy is really what we're talking about here. And it's very difficult for folks to consistently fuel your energy requirements for these types of training, especially if you're doing that kind of low carb, high fat approach that we see has become very, very popular, even amongst the perimenopause and menopausal crowd. And that's really unfortunate, because if you are training in these systems, you're probably not going to feel very good if you're cutting your carbohydrates very, very low. So remember, fat is not a significant fuel during things like strength training and high intensity exercise. We also have to remember, before we have this discussion, and we've had many podcasts on this where we've touched on and then even dived deeply into things like energy balance. So we need to make sure we're not under eating, we're not falling into a low energy availability state, which can then lead to the prolonged syndrome that we know is called Red S. And that's so common, especially in the crowd of athletes that I work with, which is we're just not even aware of how much energy intake we need. We're not understanding the different parts of our energy expenditure. We did a whole podcast episode on total daily energy expenditure and sort of what are the 4 pillars or the 4 buckets, if you will, that make that up. So we really need to make sure that you're ticking some boxes, right? In terms of sports nutrition and performing, we have to have an adequate daily intake of calories. That's very important. We want to make sure we're getting enough protein to support our lean mass and not start to lose muscle mass along the way, especially if you're somebody who tends to straddle the line where you're not quite eating enough. So we want to have enough protein energy, enough non-protein energy. And that non-protein energy, we've talked about this in a previous episode, is really our carbohydrate and our fat intake. So what that tends to mean is that if you are not fueling very well, but your protein is somewhat adequate, it usually means increasing your carbohydrate intake so that you can meet your energy expenditure and have better performance. So you have this added benefit, of course, that you're intaking and increasing a much more appropriate fuel source for the kind of training that you're doing, which is like strength training, high intensity conditioning, and those sorts of things. So I've also done an article on this on the website, and I'm not going to touch on this specific piece too much. And so if you're curious about this, we'll link it up in the show notes. I want you to go back and read the article, because it is packed with primary literature on this topic and really gets into the weeds on what is the difference between things that are efficacious in highly controlled research environments. So for example, if we're looking at a low carb approach, that's like a short-term study done in a highly controlled research setting, and maybe looking at certain clinical populations, that what is efficacious in the research may not necessarily be effective for the real world. And that includes for busy, athletic people like yourself. When it comes to doing this stuff in the real world with real people who have real challenges and are dealing with things like schedules and habits and behavior change and environmental challenges, like what's going on around you, and social support, and in the presence or lack of that thing, that it is very difficult for people to sort of make the necessary tweaks that they need to in order to even possibly see that this is going to be like their best bet for a fueling approach. And then we've also talked about this a little bit on the podcast in the past, that when we're talking about fueling, we need to also remember that fueling is specific to like our strength or performance related goals. And that those things that we need to do differently, or we need to like tweak or consider changing in order to support the goals that we have to also come from that fueling perspective, as like the extra or different things that we do in our approach, not just a general nutrition perspective. So in other words, as an athletic person, you're going to have needs that are probably different from just a general baseline of like solid nutrition. It will still be there, by the way. And when my students come into Strength Nutrition Unlocked, we assess very quickly, where do you need to go first? Do you need to start focusing on foundations first? Or can you go ahead and jump to like the more advanced topics? Because a lot of the challenges and difficulties, or the reasons people aren't seeing results off the top of the, I was going to say off the top of the bat. That's not the right saying. Off the bat, are due to like the inconsistency with foundations and the chaos that's going on with what they're eating or not eating and those sorts of things, like their approach and their habits and those sorts of things. So yes, the performance elements, the fueling elements matter, but the foundations, the baseline that we lay is extremely important as well. So just to say that all of that prefaces what I'm going to go into next. And again, we could talk for like days and days and days about this, but I really want to present from the perspective of athletic women who are lifting and probably doing shorter duration conditioning sessions. Like, what do we need to think about in terms of carb intake? So again, it's always going to be contextual, and I'll probably say that 50 more times in this episode. So if you're somebody who's undertaking regular weight training, you're trying to build muscle, you're trying to add strength, again, the general gist here in this episode is specific to that context. So we kind of want to think about minimum requirements first. So before we go into anything specifically about sport requirement, technically speaking, our carbohydrate requirement for our absolute need is technically 0 because our brain has a requirement for glucose. It's about 130 grams a day. Our red blood cells have a need for glucose about 50 grams a day. And we have this process in our bodies called gluconeogenesis, which is, so if you think about what the word is, gluco meaning glucose, neo meaning new, genesis means make. So we can make new glucose from other substances in our body, things like lactic acid, certain amino acids, and the glycerol backbone of fats. So we have this idea that while we have like a minimum protein requirement, we know that as people who are training and prioritizing muscle, we have a higher need, generally speaking, than the bare minimum, so that we can actually accomplish the goals that we set out. So we can build muscle tissue, for example. So I guess the flip side to this, or the analogy here, the parallel could be that yes, we can make glucose from these other things. However, side note also, we don't want to be consuming amino acids from our muscle tissue in order to make carbohydrate, in order to make glucose through gluconeogenesis. That doesn't make a lot of sense. If we have food available, we don't want to consume the amino acids, some of which may come from our muscle tissue, in order to create new glucose to then feed our brain and feed our blood cells, right? So what we want to think about here is if you are strength training, you are participating in these kinds of activities, you're doing this like moderate to high intensity or lifting weights, right? Like these shorter duration types of training, that you want to be able to consume enough carbohydrate to support the training itself. And we also need to think about carbohydrates being protein sparing, as I just mentioned. So we want to use carbs for our training, to fuel our training, while proteins are being used to repair and build new tissue. So this is just kind of a general argument for, or a general nudge toward having a baseline of carbohydrate intake that allows these other things like sparing protein to occur, and also to be able to fuel our sessions in terms of that energy system domain that we're hanging out in quite frequently. I'm sure there can be someone who is able to argue with me either way. And again, know that I'm not presenting this here from the context of somebody who's like on a very specific therapeutic diet for a very, very particular reason. So I like to think about it from the perspective of adequate fueling goes beyond absolute minimums. So I tend to encourage people to start with a more realistic starting point and having a minimum of carbohydrate in their day if they're physically active and participating in these kinds of training, and then to try not to decrease past that minimum, but really build on that as a place to go. So that's about 130 grams of carbohydrates a day. And I'm not going to, on this podcast, give like specific examples, because that can really be tweaked and sussed and judged based on what you are doing and what you like and what you need. But suffice to say is like, we really don't want to dip much below that, and really use that as a baseline, as a basement that we can build on top of. So before we go into some of the other specifics, a really kind of quick touch here on carbohydrates and the menstrual cycle. Currently, we're still doing, researchers, I say researchers are doing a lot of investigation into things like menstrual cycle and performance. It's been really difficult, for example, to draw broad sweeping universal recommendations on like exercise prescription based on the current body of research that we have. However, if we kind of think about what's going on with sports nutrition and what we know about the menstrual cycle in general, just wanted to touch on a couple of points. First things foremost, again, sports nutrition recommendations for female athletes are generally based on accepted principles, such as total energy intake being a top or fundamental priority. And we mentioned that earlier in this episode. So in other words, first things first, we need to make sure you're eating enough so as to not fall into low energy availability states, especially on an ongoing basis. We also know that carbs will tend to increase as the length and intensity of your training and or competitions increases. So that's a pretty across the board, like standard. We know this to be the case, right? What about sex specific considerations for females? Research into the menstrual cycle and performance or performance nutrition really still needs to come up. There is still not a lot of consensus, and it's been really hard at this point for researchers to draw universal recommendations about things like exercise requirements, or, for example, changes in nutrition between the follicular phase and the luteal phase for all menstruating individuals. We're not quite there in terms of the research supporting those things. And we know, at least with exercise, with training, an N=1 approach is probably your best bet. But what do we know about things like carbohydrate or fuel usage? Research tends to indicate that there is a difference during the menstrual cycle, that in the follicular phase versus the luteal phase, there might be a difference in fuel usage. So for example, in the follicular phase, carbohydrate oxidation appears to be greater than in the luteal phase. Also, in the luteal phase, we tend to have more protein oxidation, which means proteins are being broken down more readily. And this, along with other factors, may be at play. Although from what I've read, we, again, still need more information before making a broad sweeping generalizations. Also, some studies tend to indicate a higher basal metabolic rate, or BMR, in the second half of the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, although the amount of that increase tends to vary. And I've seen kind of a general range anywhere from 2 to 11% of a slight increase in basal metabolic rate. Now, can we translate that into exact amounts that every menstruating individual should eat more in the luteal phase automatically? It's a little bit hard to draw those universal recommendations based on the current research that we currently have. However, one thing I did see listed in one of the reviews that I will include in the show notes is that the information on the difference in carbohydrate oxidation between the two halves of the cycle could potentially be influential in strategies like carbohydrate loading that are really relevant for endurance sports. And that's, again, kind of outside the scope of this particular episode. So now let's take a more specific look at carbohydrate ranges for strength athletes or people who are doing shorter duration, perhaps more intense sessions. What do we know? So in the field of sports nutrition, there is kind of a movement away from solely using total energy for the day. So for example, total calories or total energy expenditure, and then calculating macronutrient percentages off of that. And I talked about that in a previous episode, why it's an issue or why it can be an issue. But suffice to say, you may still on your travels around the internet hear things like, athletes should look for somewhere between 45 and 65% of their total daily calories coming from carbohydrates. Again, that's going to be highly contextual, because if somebody is training for an ultra marathon or is doing a lot of endurance training, they may be at the higher end of that range. Whereas someone who's lifting weights or doing shorter sessions, maybe you're doing some sprinting or some short high intensity sessions, might fall lower on that end of the spectrum. So that's where knowing your needs and working with someone who can help you figure that out can really be helpful in customizing this to your training. The other issue with using percentages is that many of the women that I work with, at least, underestimate how much actual energy they need daily. And so because of that, everything you calculate off of that estimate is too low. So this can be really challenging. And I've seen it happen so many times where someone will calculate, or I should say, estimate their total daily energy expenditure. And they won't like the number that they see because it'll freak them out. They're like, "Oh, that's too high." So then they go back and they readjust maybe their activity level, and they kind of like lie a little bit in order to drive the calories down. So then when they're calculating how much carbohydrate or how much protein they need off of that total, so they're looking for that percentage, they are far too low. And we've talked about that again on a previous episode. But suffice to say, there's a bit of a push now to work off of like absolute requirements based on body weight. So taking like a grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight approach. We've also talked about protein and absolute requirements for protein and how that can be calculated off of grams of protein per kilogram of body weight for a daily amount, and then how we split it from there. So when it comes to, and I'm going to kind of list off a spectrum here of like different quantities. You can see like there's kind of a happy medium here. So the ISSN, International Society of Sports Nutrition, which is where I have my sports nutrition certification, recommends a carbohydrate intake of 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for general physical activity of 30 to 60 minutes per day on a frequency of like 3 to 4 days a week. So this covers a lot of you actually who are listening to this show, that you're kind of in that shorter duration, maybe you train 3, 4, 5 days a week. You're kind of in that range. But again, even there is a range, right? Your individual needs may fall within that range, but you're going to have to figure out what that is. And that's where somebody who's qualified in understanding this stuff can really help you. The International Olympic Committee also uses that 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day as a baseline amount of carbohydrate. And then for strength training athletes, they recommend 4 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. Precision Nutrition, which is a really widely known nutrition coaching organization, recommends up to 3.5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for, quote, regular people undertaking little activity or only light activity, but that strength athletes might be more in that range of, again, 3.5 to 5.5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And then we see other recommendations for menopausal women, which might be a little bit lower, kind of in that 2.5 to 3.5 grams per kilogram body weight per day. Are we seeing kind of a pattern here, right? Where we're kind of in that 3 to 4 or 3 to 5 range when we're talking about grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day. And for the athletes that I work with, again, we're kind of looking at a range based on their intensity level, which is very similar to some of the things that you just heard that I listed off. So we really want to start thinking about setting up a baseline intake and then adjusting from there. And again, that's what a really good coach, nutritionist, who's qualified in sports nutrition, especially, or registered dietitian, et cetera, can help you actually do. So when it comes to over and above a solid foundation, we know that there are some things that generally you have to think about in order to make sure you're properly fueled. We talked about the difference between kind of general nutrition and fueling, right? And it depends on several factors. How often do you train? And I would also say, along with that, like, what is the flow of your week? Do you have 3 hard days back to back and then you have 2 days off? Or is it every other day? Or, what does your actual training split look like from week to week? Are there multiple sessions in a day? Are you currently preparing for a competition? What is the duration and intensity of your sessions? What has your nutrition been like in the hours prior to your training? So yes, we want to think about that baseline and making sure that we're meeting our energy needs. But from there, how you start to move those levers seems on the surface to be quite simple. However, and I can again speak from personal experience, this is where I was falling short as an athlete, 10, 12 years ago, and prior to that as well, until I got support and worked with a sports nutritionist. And it was really in the implementation of the concepts and the information that was so valuable. And the head trash that I had to deal with. And I see, a lot of my students have mindset challenges around even the concept of eating more. And bless the person that I worked with, because I probably frustrated him a lot because I was constantly, sending updates, and I was talking about my frustration or my reluctance to like increase my carbohydrate intake and like my fears and what would happen and being unsure and probably being a little bit non-compliant at times, although I was really trying. But that's where the support comes in. And I know it's easy to listen to a podcast and say, yep, yep, tick, tick, tick. I got to do all these things. But when you get out into your real life and you eat food, not just macronutrients, you don't just eat numbers on a page. Your body is not a spreadsheet. I always say that to my students. It's in the implementation. It's in the finesse of, how did the pieces come together, like your schedule and your environment and your social supports and the support of a community or your coach. Like, how do you start to put all those pieces together? And frankly, most of you listening to this show don't have formal training in nutrition, and that's fine. You don't have to, but you oftentimes put a lot of pressure on yourself to be able to do those things, or you feel like, oh, I should just keep doing it myself and doing it myself. And then you kind of keep rolling into the same challenges and not being able to like see above the weeds and go, oh, actually my destination is like in that direction. because I'm down here in the weeds and I can't get that perspective. So that's really where a coach, a nutritionist who's certified and experienced in sports nutrition or a sports dietitian, like those folks like myself can help you to actually move forward instead of being stuck in the weeds. So, I think it's important to talk about that as a little add on here to why getting support is so incredibly valuable and important. So I want to leave you with some summaries here and stuff that we talked about. So we started with a bit of an overarching look at, how did we end up here and what are some of the challenges that we can face? What do we know about our training? Again, the lens through which we looked at this podcast was really strength and higher intensity athletes. We know that endurance athletes, for example, or ultra endurance athletes are going to have different needs, that our carbohydrate intake can be kind of along a spectrum for that reason. So we have to start kind of thinking about where we want to be. We know that our bodies can make their own glucose, thankfully, but that if we have an eye toward athletic performance, it's really in our best interests to start considering beyond a baseline of nutrition, how do we fuel ourselves appropriately and what does that look like? And then we also touched on a few topics having to do with the menstrual cycle and what we know there, which turns out it's not a whole lot at the moment. So it's really hard to draw universal across the board recommendations for fueling and training, frankly, for that reason. And an N equals one approach, a personalized approach is really, really important. We also just touched on here why having a coach or having someone to guide you who's qualified, a nutritionist or dietitian, is so important so that you can see above the weeds and start to implement this stuff in a way that helps you see the big picture, but not get caught in all of the same challenges that might be stopping you. Let's finish up with some very general recommendations here. And specifics we do inside Strength Nutrition Unlocked. I'm just going to say that because we have to look at the big picture. We have to look at what are the training sessions that you're doing, how often, like this is all the customization that we do, but some very general reminders for you if you're doing the type of training that we discussed in this episode. So we want to make sure we're hitting our baseline of 130 grams of carbs a day and really making an effort to not drop below that. And then based on our activity level, we're kind of in that 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight carbohydrate a day. But again, even within that range, there's a lot of customization that can happen. And of course, if we are more active than that, then that number goes up. Our energy requirements during training are rising. Our energy need total in the day, therefore, increases. So you can see why the more training you do, the more you need to fuel. I know that sounds simple, but it takes a lot of repetition sometimes for you to soak it up, right? We want to think about, potentially based on your training schedule, maybe consuming 15 to 20 grams of carbohydrates prior to a training session, especially if you are training in the morning and you have not had a full meal or two yet, or maybe even three, right? So highly recommend you start to think about getting away from fasted training. We've done episode with Dr. Stacey Sims on that as well. So if you want to go dive into that one, we'll link it up in the show notes. Away from your training, we want to focus on mixed macronutrient meals that include protein, complex carbs, fiber, and fat. The closer you then get to your training, the focus shifts to more simple or easy to digest carbohydrates and more minimal fiber. So tapering off on the fiber intake as you get a little bit closer to your sessions themselves. We want to think about complex carbohydrates, right? Those are our plant-based whole grains, beans, legumes, fiber-rich fruits and veg. And, athletic women over 40, if you're concerned about things like managing your energy intake, like you don't want to be in a huge surplus, you're just a little bit concerned about that stuff, then we focus a majority of what we eat on those sources. I think everybody thinks that carbs are all just highly refined and ultra processed options. And that's simply not true. Carbohydrate selection is so diverse. You have so many choices, and it's not all just junk food. And I'm using heavy air quotes here. Okay. And then, of course, if you're training more, like twice a day, your strength sessions are more extensive, then you may need to do some more specific tweaking to, say, for example, what you're eating beforehand, or what you include in your post workout. So, those are just some general recommendations. Of course, we will help you to customize that within Strength Nutrition Unlocked or in one on one coaching. So, highly recommend that if you're looking for somebody to just help you lay it out, without all of the confusion and in a way that makes sense, that goes with the training and includes things like recovery, check out Strength Nutrition Unlocked. I hope you learned something on this episode. Let me know in the comments here on YouTube. What did you learn? What are your favorite carbs? I would love to hear that. What's your favorite carbohydrate source? And if you're following along on your favorite podcast app and you want to share that with me, send me a DM. Would love to hear from you there. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on all the places that you listen to this podcast, and on YouTube, ring the bell for more notifications of new episodes and other videos as well. Thanks so much for being with me here as we dived into the wonderful and crazy world of carbohydrates. And until next time, stay strong.